Hi, I'm Gabrielle, and I will be talking about the Sustainable Energy Profile for North Carolina. Today, I'm going to talk about the current energy conditions in North Carolina and some environmental concerns, and then I'll talk about future projections for the year 2038. Energy production within the state, this is what's produced, not necessarily what's used. There are no fossil fuels produced within the state. They only do nuclear and renewables within North Carolina. Nuclear, they produce about 448 trillion BTUs of nuclear power and about 201.3 trillion BTUs of renewables. And renewables that's a bunch of different energy resources combined into one. Now here's a chart of the energy consumption within the state, and notice how they do use a lot of fossil fuels. Even though they aren't actually producing that within the state, that is their largest energy consumption in North Carolina. And their smallest energy consumption group is the renewables at 222 trillion BTUs used in the year 2016. So where is all of this energy being used? You can see on this pie chart we have four main energy use sectors. You've got residential, commercial, those are your big shopping centers, industrial, which are your factories, and transportation, like we said before, your planes and trains and cars. That's where the majority of fossil fuels are going, is towards this transportation sector. And going forward on the next slide, we're going to talk about power plants, generation, and that's going to talk about the other three sectors. Electricity generation in North Carolina from fossil fuels is nearly 8,000 megawatt hours. From nuclear, it's nearly 4,000 megawatt hours. And from renewables, all of the other renewables combined is about 1,400,000 megawatt hours. The consumption information per capita for the energy consumption is about 251 million BTUs per person, and the yearly expenditures was about $2,888 annually. This information is from 2016. And this chart is comparing the energy costs in North Carolina to the national average per energy sector. You can see for each of the three main energy sectors, besides transportation, it was cheaper than the rest of the nation. Then we have to talk about CO2 emissions. North Carolina is ranked 14th highest nationwide. They produced 120 million metric tons of CO2 emissions in 2015. And we have to wonder, why is that so high when they don't produce any fossil fuels within their state? They're buying them from out of state and using them, but they don't actually produce any fossil fuels within North Carolina. And going back to that question, North Carolina doesn't produce any fossil fuels within the state, and yet you can see over here comparing low versus high carbon outputs. They consume about 68.7% of their total energy consumption is fossil fuels. You can compare that consumption. Slide. These are their renewables. They have a bunch of renewable resource power plants, but they're small. They're not as effective as these fossil fuel ones yet. North Carolina currently has 3 nuclear power plants. Theoretically they could expand more, but they're very expensive, so that's not a very likely option for expanding clean energy. This is the current solar capacity. The western edge of the state is limited into how much they can do solar because it's very mountainous. so it's not ideal for solar. But the rest of the state, there is some available land, but that does need to be used for other purposes as well. Hydropower, North Carolina has already maximized its use of rivers that are viable for power plants, so they're maxed out here. They cannot expand hydropower anymore. Biomass, they can expand their use of biomass, especially with solid waste. That's the one in the lower picture is solid waste, and the top picture is agricultural products, most likely wood. Solid waste would be a good option. It would certainly be something to do with all of the animal manure that's being stored across the state. There's currently only one wind farm in North Carolina, and there's a recent election this year showed there is actually public support, or at the very least acceptance, for expanding wind energy in North Carolina. So this is a potential option for expanding clean energy in North Carolina. So every type of energy production is going to have some environmental concerns. There's just no way around that. What the fossil fuels do tend to be the worst. Coal has toxic waste, coal ash, and there are other chemicals in the coal besides just carbon, so there other toxic emissions going into the atmosphere. Nuclear energy does have radioactive waste. The mining has, some toxic effects on the local environment. And then solar and wind, they can and hydro affect migratory paths and biomass. Something to note for the biomass waste, yes, it has carbon emissions, but because you're replacing that, it's closer to being carbon neutral than coal or other fossil fuels, because it can be replaced. And it does produce ash waste, but this biomass ash does tend to be less toxic than coal ash. This year, a hurricane swept through North Carolina and caused massive flooding. That also caused toxic coal ash and manure to contaminate surrounding communities, which is not good. Projecting current population and industry growths into 20 years into the future, that gets us to 2038. We'll have a population of approximately 12.8 million people, which has an energy demand of about 3,000 million BTUs. And the industry growth will be about 6.34 million jobs, which would be an energy demand of about 1,600 million BTUs. So adding that together, we'll have a total energy demand from the population industry growth of about 4,800 million BTUs, which is nearly 1,400 megawatt hours. Now we can compare the current versus the 2038 projected energy profile. Some key differences to note. The percentage of the oil by consumption goes down from 1.3% to just 0.1% of the energy consumption. Wind goes up, it nearly doubles from 0.6% in 2018 to 1.2% in 2038. And another key difference is biomass. It also goes up from 1.8% in 2018 to 3.3% in 2038. Is this a viable energy profile? Yeah, it is. It's not a reasonable assumption to guess that we'll be able to completely get rid of fossil fuels. We are set in our ways. We have a lot of infrastructure that's hard to change around. 20 years, it seems like a long time, but it's short in the overall time frame of how this energy production changes. So we've projected a decrease in about 7% over 20 years in coal, 90% in oil. That was a very small percentage of consumption in North Carolina, so I figured it would probably be easy to replace that one with some others, mostly biomass, and we replaced biomass. It increased by nearly 85% in 20 years. This was where we figured we could use the, the agricultural waste, lots of poop, and other wastes, just increasing our biomass from the waste production across the state. And wind is increasing heavily too, now that there's, demonstrated support for wind. There are some detractors, but the state is willing to accept it. That's going to increase a bit more potentially. Hydro and nuclear didn't change at all, just because hydropower is already maxed out. It can't really go up, and we didn't want to decrease that since we have an increased energy demand. And nuclear didn't go up either because it's a very expensive option, and public support for that is waning. This new energy profile shows a reduction in coal waste and oil products because we're burning less coal and less oil. We're also reducing the amount of animal waste just sitting idle in pits. We'll actually use that and burn it off. That will reduce the overall amount of waste that's just sitting around in the state. And then CO2 emissions, this is a rough estimate, about 69.9 million metric tons of CO2 emissions in 2038. This is down from 42% from the 2015 emissions. And now, to sum up, we went over the current energy profile for North Carolina, and then we talked about some environmental concerns and potential ways to improve the energy profile, and then we created a new improved profile for 2038.